Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be talking about Dire Avengers and finding out if they actually suck. So, when Dire Avengers were revealed in the Aeldari Codex, I took one look at them and said, wow, these are going to be a little more niche, a little more useful than the old Dire Avengers. If you guys remember, the old Dire Avengers had one less attack, but they had lethal hits built in to their weapons, and really no one ever took them. They were one of those units that were very rarely taken outside of a couple of niche instances by a couple players here and there for chip damage and just decent Overwatch sometimes. I was a big fan of them in a block of 10 with the Zerman and more casual games, and that's about it. However, I did kind of come to the understanding later on in the edition with all the nerfs to Overwatch and different things like that, that Overwatch was simply something that could be gotten around with the Dire Avengers, that is, because they had a range of 18, and most things that could kill the Dire Avengers were range 24 or greater. So they really struggled to stay alive long enough to prove their worth. Even with the Zerman, I think it was kind of funny because the Zerman was kind of like the big attraction of that unit. Being able to overwatch twice in a turn and stuff like that was kind of insane if your opponent walked into it, or if you were able to set something up to where your opponent had no choice. But it was difficult and tricky, and it would not work in higher levels of competitive play. So when the new Dire Avengers came out, I was a little bit excited. I saw their price point at 75, and I was like, okay, well, they're the same amount of points, but they're getting an additional shot. They don't get lethal hits, but they get sustained hits within half range. So I was really excited because for the first time, we have a fairly cheap unit that can deal very good damage to light infantry, right? Things like with a 5-up save or worse, these guys just absolutely shred. However, the general consensus is Dire Avengers are just not that good. I have come to the conclusion that maybe people are, one, thinking of them in the wrong way, and two, overreacting at how quote unquote bad they are. And I'm going to kind of go through a couple of comparisons with you in this video to, and kind of talk it through with you guys so you guys understand that yes, there's some problems with Dire Avengers, but it actually has nothing to do with their damage output, and we'll explain why in the video. So without further ado, let us dive right in. So we're going to be looking at their stats, weapons, and special rules, their strengths and weaknesses, their combos and synergies, and lastly, we're going to be talking through the big reason why Dire Avengers are poorly received and one possible fix. And just to foreshadow this, I don't think GW is actually going to quote unquote fix them in the way a lot of people want them to be fixed, but we're going to be talking about, just some different ways and different ideas about how to use Dire Avengers effectively and what to expect out of them. So here are their stats. Pretty simple, basic stat line for Aspect Warriors. Movement 7, Toughness 3, Save 4. 1 wound apiece, of course. They have a better than average leadership and OC 1. And here is, and a 5+ invul, of course. And here's where we come across the first main issue about Dire Avengers. They're a unit that really wants to be in the thick of it. They want to be on objectives. They want to be fighting over objectives in the midfield. And they have OC1, right? They're not a battle line unit. And a lot of people kind of say things like, well, if they had more OC, they'd be more useful and stuff like that. And I do think that is the case. They would be more useful, of course. If any unit just gets an extra OC, that's a big boon in an objective-based game. It might not come up all the time, but when it does come up, it comes up big. However, realistically speaking, Dire Avengers are one of those units that historically have been a troop selection. They historically have been a battle line type unit. However, in 10th edition, GW decided to go with the route of Dire Avengers are just damage dealers to infantry, right? That's kind of what they were going for. Yes, they battle in the midboard, and that's where you really want them to be, but they don't capture objectives all that well. And I think that's part of the problem with this unit, is that there's some mixed signaling going on. GW is telling people this unit is a great, unit for, midboard skirmishes and stuff like that. In reality, the unit is kind of more front-loaded in other ways. So as for their ranged weapons, they have the Avenger Shuriken Catapult. It has 4 attacks, hitting on 3s, strength 4, AP -1, damage 1, assault. This is very similar to the Intercessor's weapon, except the Intercessor's weapon has more range, has the option to be heavy, I believe, and that's about it. Other than that, Intercessors are getting only 2 attacks apiece, but they double their attacks now, and they get sticky objectives, which is pretty insane. We have the Shuriken Pistol option for the Exarch, but this is something you're never going to take. As far as their close combat, only the Exarch can have close combat weapons, and their close combat's very weak. So unlike, Space Marine equivalents, Aspect Warriors, unless they're combat Aspect Warriors, typically have very weak combat profiles. We have Strength 3, 2 attacks, hitting on 3+, AP 0, damage 1. The Dire Sword's a little better. It's basically a power sword with 4 attacks. Not great. And the Power Glaive is, a little less attacks, 3 attacks, but more strength, more AP. No damage too, which is quite the shame. So basically, the melee weapons of the Exarch, although supposedly supposed to be much better, are actually one of the weakest profiles out of all the Aspect Warriors. So, when you have Warp Spiders being able to put out more damage output than the Dire Avenger Exarch, which, by the way, lore-wise, Dire Avengers are supposed to be good at shooting and in combat situations, especially the Exarch. An Exarch armed with, a Dire Sword or a Power Glaive is supposedly supposed to be one of the best combatants of the Aspect Warriors, but unfortunately, it's just, this is one of those times where the lore doesn't match the rules. So, terrible melee options. You're always going to give the Exarch the additional Shuriken Catapult. Their ability is Blade Storm. So the ranged weapons equipped by models in this unit have the sustained hits 1 ability while targeting an enemy within half range. So this is essentially 9 inches. That's very short. That puts them in range of all sorts of things. It puts them in range of reactive moves. It puts them in range of abilities. It puts them in range of Overwatch, right? So typically speaking, yeah, you can ignore Overwatch with a Battle Focus token, but you can only do it once in the movement phase. So these guys being a more cheap, expendable type unit, they're really not a good target for it if you have something better to do that turn. So, there might not be anything better to do in a single, turn than give these guys immune to Overwatch, but unfortunately, most of the time there is. So this is a good ability. However, I think it's really kind of lacking in its condition. Its condition is kind of weak. I think this should have been closest eligible target. I think they should have just made this ranged weapons equipped by models in this unit have sustained hits 1 ability against the closest eligible target. That would have been way better. Or a target on an objective or something like that. It would have made the ability much stronger. But it is a good ability. It just has a condition that you really need to get around. Okay, what about their war gear abilities? So the Exarch can take a Shimmer Shield. It has a 4+ invul for the bearer. Not great, especially when, this is a more expendable unit anyway. And you have an Aspect Shrine token. And again, typically speaking, there's no critical effects you're going to be getting with this unit in melee or at ranged, except that sustained hits 1. And it's really not that powerful for the Exarch even to use it, because his weapons are just going to be double the amount of shots. It's not necessarily more powerful. And by the way, this Aspect token, it's really just going to be for using it in conjunction with Asurman so he can get, sustained hits on his Dev Wound mini feat turn. And we'll talk about Asurman in a second. As far as the war gear options, I kind of said it before, the Exarch can take a Dire Sword or a Power Glaive, or it can take an additional Avenger Shuriken Catapult. You're always going to go with the Catapult. And then, of course, you can also give the Exarch a Shimmer Shield instead of the pistol, so kind of loses its range attacks, but you can give it, kind of a combination of Dire Sword, Shimmer Shield, or Dire Sword, pistol, or Power Glaive pistol, or whatever, right? So you can give it a number of combat options. Unfortunately, none of them are that good. And then lastly, we come to the point values. They are 75 points for 5, 150 for 10, and that's it. That's it. They are one of the cheapest aspect warriors, sharing a cost with striking scorpions, but they also do one of the least amounts of damage against marine type targets. Now, when I say least, they actually do more damage than one of the other aspect warriors, and you would actually be surprised which ones those are. And if you've guessed striking scorpions, you're correct. And I know it seems wild, but Dire Avengers against a target that's out in the open will do consistently more damage than striking scorpions will on the charge. Now, the reason why striking scorpions are much better and why people use them is because of their abilities. Infiltrate and scout and stealth are extremely powerful abilities, especially in combination with each other. Striking scorpions are much more than a damage dealing unit. They are a utility unit as well. So they have different things that they do. The only thing Dire Avengers do is shoot. And that right there is why I think people don't really like them. Because when you're building up an Eldar army, you typically want units that can do a myriad of different things and not just a single thing, and mediocrely at that. So when I say these guys are mediocre, I don't mean they're terrible, right? I mean, cost effective wise, for 75 points, their weapons are designed to kill light infantry, and they do that very well. They kill on average within 9 inches, they kill an average of 9 Imperial Guard infantry. Anywhere between 8 and 9, it's somewhere in the middle of there. And that's extremely good, right? And then they can follow up with a charge, because they're already going to be in close, so you might as well. They can finish off the squad, and they can land on the objective. That's the general idea of this unit. This unit is meant to tackle lighter infantry, meant to sweep those lighter infantry off of objectives, and then get on that objective themselves. They might be a half-decent target for something like rapid ingress or just putting them in strat reserve because, again, they're only 75 points. And they kill light infantry very well. Things like cultists, Imperial Guardsmen, Gretchen, all those types of units will be, kind of destroyed by this unit. Unfortunately, we come back to that Blade Storm ability being within half range, which means once you come into reserve, if you're not, you're going to be outside of 9 inches, so you're not going to get that effect. So you are going to have a little bit of a loss in damage if you do that. And lastly, their keywords, they do have grenades. So that is cool. They can chuck a grenade, which is nice, but most Eldar aspect warriors and also guardians have grenades too. So it's not really unique. Okay, let's talk about their strengths and weaknesses. So I talked about a couple of these, but I think one of their main strengths is they are one of the cheapest aspect warriors. They're only 75 points. They're a good anti-horde unit. They kill an average of, 10 guardsmen on average between, a shooting attack and a charge. And that's okay. It's not the best, but it's okay. They do more damage as well against marine equivalents than striking scorpions do on average rolls, assuming that they're not in cover. So that is a point for them as well. If you're shooting at a squad of marines, on average, they're going to do a little more than 2 wounds or 2 kills against them. So they're going to probably get about 2.5 kill, well, 2.5, you guys know what I mean, right? 2 kills and a half of a kill. So 5 wounds total about. Whereas the striking scorpions will only get about 4. Now, functionally speaking, that doesn't make much of a difference, right? Dire Avengers being able to shoot a tiny bit better than striking scorpions are in melee. They're killing the same amount of marines. That doesn't really matter a lot if you, kind of factor in close combat. Striking scorpions are just doing more damage in combat because they're allowed to, kind of have that greater armor save. They're allowed to shoot their pistols beforehand if they get the ability to. So striking scorpions are going to be a unit that is just more versatile in those kind of situations. Their weaknesses are that they're short range. They only get sustained hits within half range, like I said. There's a number of problems with that I've already outlined. And anti-horde can also be performed by other aspects as a secondary role. And like I said, striking scorpions can do it, warp spiders can do it. Swooping hawks aren't quite as good in the anti-horde role, in my opinion, because they don't have that AP -1, and it actually does matter because a lot of horde units will get a better save against swooping hawks. By the way, guys, swooping hawks, they've fallen quite a bit in my eyes. I don't think they're as good as Dire Avengers at dealing with infantry, but for the 10 extra points that you pay for swooping hawks, you're also getting a little bit of mortal wounds. You're also getting fly. You're getting movement 14, which is double that of the Dire Avengers. You're getting deep strike, and you're getting lethal hits, which means you can trade up into tougher things and do some chip damage against tougher units, whereas the Dire Avengers really can't, right? The Dire Avengers are pigeonholed into this anti-infantry role where they can either do a couple of kills against a Marine equivalent unit, or they can kind of wipe out Imperial Guard unit or something equivalent. And that honestly is a role that is not really needed in the army. And I think that is going to be the main problem. We'll talk about that more near the end of the video when I talk about the main issues of Dire Avengers. But just think about that while we're doing this video, because we're also going to talk about some ways in which Dire Avengers do kind of make up their value. It's just not in the ways that you might initially think. Okay, let's talk about some combos and synergies. So these guys actually do benefit from a lot of the combinations and synergies within the detachments. And I'm going to just say this right off the bat. There's a number of detachments that make these guys way better. Whether or not you want to invest in the stratagems and the CP and the buffs to make the Dire Avengers good is a debate, right? Is it worth it to pump all these things into them? And maybe not, right? But the question is not if it's worth it necessarily, but can they be effective under these effects? And I actually do think, yes, they can, right? I don't know if you'd want to, spend a bunch of points on Dire Avengers. They're kind of cheap, and you do have to spend the CP and stuff, but it is kind of worth it in terms of damage. So let's take a look at this. So in Warhost, I think they're really just the best. They get the rerolls, which is great. They also get lethal hits from Preternatural Precision, and Warrior's Focus allows them to ignore things like Armor of Contempt and stealth and all that kind of stuff that they would normally have issues with. And honestly, under those effects, they have a ton of attacks. You take a squad of 10 of these guys, which is 44 attacks. You load them up with lethal hits. On average, you're getting through about 5 lethal hits with these guys. No, sorry. Even more than that, sorry. You're getting 7. 7 lethal hits going through. That is pretty good, especially since it's going to be at AP -1. And if you're shooting at like something, like a Dreadnought, has a 3-up save, maybe a regular Dreadnought, not anything special, or maybe a Rhino, who knows, right? You're shooting at something like that. You're going to do some average chip damage with them, with the lethal hits. So 7 wounds, we're not even accounting for the rerolls 1s in the War Host, or excuse me, the Aspect Host, right? So maybe you get 8 and they fail half of those. That's 4 damage. Not the greatest for 150 points, but it's not nothing, right? It's not nothing. They can do decent damage against things like that. Warp Spiders can't really do that. Swooping Hawks kind of can if you take them in a unit of 10, but they have huge 32mm bases. They're not really easy to hide. They're more expensive. And overall, just probably a worse unit to do it with because they don't have AP either. So the Rhino's just getting a natural 3-up save. So when you compare these guys to other Aspect Warriors in terms of just shooting with lethal hits, they are simply the best. Aside from Dark Reapers, because Dark Reapers just blow up transports like no other. And of course, Fire Dragons are specialized anti-tank. If you fire these guys at tough infantry, they can do quite a bit of damage with lethal hits as well, right? Shroud Runners can also take away an enemy unit's cover. So if they are in cover, Shroud Runners can help with that. They can also kind of add to that kind of blistering amount of firepower with their scatter lasers. If you look at the Warhost detachment, they can get sustained hits on 5+ fairly easily, which is pretty good, but only really with Asurman. I think in Warhost, really these guys are not great, but they're great with Asurman because if you can get sustained hits on 5s, he can go hog wild with his mini feat, and you can easily kill way more than his points value in a single turn. Now, we are going to get into trading, quote unquote, with Asurman and Dire Avengers in a second. A lot of people are unconvinced that the 270 point unit, roughly, of Asurman, actually, it's not even 270 points. I don't know why I said that, but it's about, let's see, what is it? It's 210, excuse me. So it's about 210 points for Asurman and 5 Dire Avengers. That is not a lot of points for what they can put out. And I'll kind of talk about that in a second. If we look at Guardian Battle Host, they're actually pretty good in Guardian Battle Host as well. You definitely want a big squad of these because they can get rerolls to wounds with warding salvos, or they can get pistol with Blades of Azurian, which is decent, right? It's not the greatest. It might not come up all the time, but if you're running him or, running Dire Avengers with Asurman, with the old ass man, it can be very good because he wants to be in combat. He is a good combatant. And then, of course, getting +1 to hit when on an objective or when an enemy is on an objective is also really good as well. It's actually better than rerolls ones, I think, personally, in this detachment. I would take +1 to hit over rerolls ones most times, just because, if you're getting 44 attacks with a big unit, +1 to hit is going to give you a lot more hits that you can also reroll to wound with this stratagem. In Seer Council, they can ignore cover and get AP -1 on critical wounds, which isn't bad. Having a built-in ignores cover is not bad. However, I was surprised to think that they would actually be pretty good in Ynnari, because not only do they get ignores cover, but they also get lethal hits with the Soul Sight stratagem, and they're a cheap enough unit to where you can kind of be okay with throwing them away, right? You can move them, kill a squad of 5 Space Marines with, by the way, with lethal hits, ignores cover, a full unit of 10 should be able to wipe out a squad of 5 intercessors pretty easily. You can then Overwatch if you want to, which, probably won't do that much, honestly. Their Overwatch did get considerably, nerfed or whatever, but if they die, what happens? Well, you just get to move something else on the battlefield, right? Again, I don't know if that's the most efficient way to run the Ynnari. I doubt it competitively, but they can be good in Ynnari. Warwalkers also give them AP -1, which they really enjoy. And Farseers and Eldrad can give them +1 to hit or +1 to wound with their psychic powers, which isn't bad either. So there's a lot of combos and synergies that they can benefit from in the Codex. The question is, are any of these in here, besides the ones you're just naturally going to get, worth investing in, right? Is it worth shooting a unit with a Warwalker and then shooting a unit with a Dire Avenger squad afterward? And the answer is probably not, because unless you're taking Asurman, you're probably not taking a unit of 10 of these guys, and the reason being, it kind of goes back to what I originally said, which was we don't need more anti-infantry in our armies. We have so much of it. We have absolutely tons of anti-infantry. And a lot of armies out there are either going to be one or two types. They're going to be the type that is going to hide behind walls and stage on you and then, basically come after you with fly and stuff like that. Things like Blood Angels. Space Wolves are going to, have these Thunderwolf cav that you can't even wound because they're really tough. So, in a lot of the hard matchups for Eldar, Dire Avengers just don't really do well. Imperial Guard can be a hard matchup, but it's not a hard matchup because of the infantry. It's a hard matchup because of the tanks and the indirect fire. And Dire Avengers don't do anything against tanks or indirect, right? They're just not built for it. And I think there's one thing that I would say about Dire Avengers is that they're a good counter to any guard player running like 300 guardsmen or 200 guardsmen or whatever they run in the max infantry. Dire Avengers are a good counter, right? Because guardsmen, what do they want to do? They want to get on objectives, they want to pound the OC, they want to get cover through various means, right? In the recon detachment, for example, they'll have cover, they'll have +1 armor. So having a unit of Dire Avengers and like some Shroud Runners to take away their cover so they're not getting any bonuses is a really good way of like locking down that army. Like if you had 3 units, like okay, if you are in a meta which is all horde, right? It's like Tyrannid hordes that are just running a bunch of gargoyles. Imperial Guard hordes are just running a bunch of infantry. You know, you're fighting against demons or running a bunch of bloodletters and, you know, I don't know what the Slaanesh ones are called. Demonettes, that's what it is. They're running a bunch of demonettes. You know, yeah, Dire Avengers are fantastic in that meta. But unfortunately, I don't think anybody is really in that meta right now. And that's kind of unfortunate for Dire Avengers because do they have a role? Yes. They're good at killing light infantry. Is that role needed in 10th edition at this moment with, you know, the current Pariah Nexus rules and just generally how the power of the game is curved? No, right? That's not something typically people want. And usually there's just not enough room in a list for them at the end of the day. There's just better options. Okay, now that is why we're now going to get into the big reason why Dire Avengers are poorly received. And simply put, other aspects typically do more damage against higher value targets in a single activation without any kind of stratagem support than they do. And at the same time, they have more useful roles, right? Let's take Warp Spiders, for example. They are 20 more points, but for those 20 points, you're getting a faster unit. You're getting a unit that has built-in ignores cover. Remember, I talked about that. By the way, if something is in cover, Dire Avengers are at AP 0, and that just sucks a lot of the times. You don't want to be in that position as Dire Avengers. You need something to support you, to give you ignores cover, or you need to be shooting at things out in the open. Warp Spiders don't care. They just ignores cover, and they auto-hit. So if something has stealth, they don't care about that either. Even though Warp Spiders on average have less attacks, remember that they're auto-hitting all their attacks. So there is that. And they're ignoring things like, you know, stealth and ballistic skill modifiers because of their torrent weapons. Warp Spiders also have a better Overwatch attack. They potentially have more firepower on their Exarch because their Exarch is getting 2d6 attacks at better strength and AP and better chances to wound than the Dire Avenger Exarch with his dual catapults. Warp Spiders are tougher. They have a 3+ save versus the 4+ of the Dire Avengers. Warp Spiders have the flicker jump ability, which allows them to just flicker all over the battlefield really quickly to score objectives and things like that, which is insanely good. And if you really look at it, what do Dire Avengers have in comparison to that? Well, they have sustained hits 1. Right? They have sustained hits 1. And that's it. And they're blue versus red. So if you like the color blue better, there you go. Right? Dire Avengers they look cooler for some people with their crests and everything. But I actually like Warp Spider. The look of Warp Spiders is cooler to me. So, yeah. It's just that simple, right? And Dire Avengers aren't that fast. They can't get to objectives, which is another thing. If you compare them to a combat unit, like Warp Spiders are mostly a shooting unit for the most part. If you compare them to other combat units like Howling Banshees, for example, again, they're 15 more points than Dire Avengers, but they can kill about 4 Space Marines, which is double what Avengers can do in a single round of combat, and are a great heroic intervention unit because they have fights first. So they have more utility than Dire Avengers. In matchups that Eldar struggle in, Blood Angels, right? Oh my god, right? So many people reach out to me. Blood Angels destroyed me. When Pariah Nexus first came out, guys, when we had the index, I had probably about 4 or 5 people like, what do I do against Blood Angels? Help me against Blood Angels. You know, what do I do? Luckily, I have a Blood Angels opponent that I play against. Not super competitive. I'll say this. He thinks he's competitive, but, you know, I mean, honestly, there's some choices in his army that are a little bit suspect. But he swears by them. They just never end up panning out as well as the meta units would. But that's another story. He's a decent player. He plays the Blood Angels well. It's just that, unfortunately, doesn't have the best build, maybe. And honestly, Blood Angels are really, really strong. The only thing that can really stop them as an Aeldari player is fights first and sometimes Overwatch. We don't have a ton of good Overwatch against Marines nowadays. So Howling Banshees are your answer. So it's like, what do? Do you buy a squad of, or purchase a squad of Dire Avengers to fight against a combat army like Blood Angels? No, because Howling Banshees are just going to do a better job every single time. They're more reliable. You know, they're killier than Dire Avengers in a single activation, which does matter. You know, it takes multiple activations for Dire Avengers to be able to get to that much damage. And Banshees can protect your other units, whereas Dire Avengers can't. They have trouble protecting themselves, let alone other units. So when you're making that decision in your list, oh, do I want, so I need something to kill infantry units like Marines, or I need something to heroically intervene, you're always going to pick the Banshees, right? Pretty much always. And Striking Scorpions, I talked about this a little bit before. They don't do more damage, but they have a lot more utility for the cost. Having Scout, Stealth, Infiltrate, it just makes them really good at scoring objectives. They can alpha strike your opponent from turn one. They can get to places your opponent doesn't or can't really protect that easily. And they're just a much better unit overall, strategically speaking. So basically, at the end of the day, Dire Avengers just don't have a universally useful role in the army. And that's why Dire Avengers aren't that good. However, let's real quick talk about the Assman, Asurman. And this is where things change. Because no longer are the Dire Avengers expected to do it all themselves. They are now supporting a killing machine, which is Asurman. So basically, the Dire Avengers give him sustained hits 1 built in. Now, the reason why it's okay for him to be within half range is because, and I believe, if not mistaken, let me just double check real quick, but I think his weapons are actually a higher range than the Dire Avengers weapons. I think he has 24 inches. But let me double check. Okay, yeah, so he's 24, which means that half range for him is 12. So even if your Dire Avengers aren't getting sustained hits 1, he is within 12 inches of an opponent, which is really important because at 12 inches, you can make it harder for your opponent to overwatch with things like flamers. So what you basically do is you put Asurman within that 12 inches, and then you put everything else behind it, and your opponent, well, let me put it this way, you only put one of your units within 12 of one of your opponent's models, and that way the only model that can really shoot is that specific model. So if it's a flamer, for example, they can only shoot one flamer out of the unit. So if you're going after, Terminators or, anything with a powerful shooting attack, you're only going to get like one flamer attack at you, and that's if you don't use the battle focus token to ignore Overwatch, which you're mostly going to do, right? So the Dire Avengers become kind of this like little shield for Asurman. So that's one thing. They give him the sustained hits at 12 inches, which is really powerful on his feet turn because the more attacks he has, right, against infantry, he's getting anti-infantry 2+, damage 3, or 3+, sorry, anti-infantry 3+, damage 3, and, with the sustained hits, and devastating wounds, by the way, and with the sustained hits, he's just going to churn out kill after kill after kill. You use their aspect token to boost it further, so he gets a free sustained hit after he rolls the hit. In aspect host, of course, you can reroll 1s, which is helpful sometimes. Sometimes it's not. In Warhost, you can get sustained hits on 5s, so it's even better. So there's a lot of just innate synergy that Dire Avengers give Asurman. Because Asurman doesn't have sustained hits himself, right? He relies on his unit to get it. And I would argue that for 135 points, if he doesn't have sustained hits somehow, he's probably not going to do as much damage as he could. And on his mini feat turn, you want to maximize that damage because it's only once per game that he gets that. The Dire Avengers themselves at that point are just kind of mopping up, right? Asurman does most of the damage. Maybe he kills like actually, mostly he kills the whole unit, right? Death Shroud Terminators, squad of 5, they're all dead. He's going to kill every single one of them, doesn't matter. Especially in Aspect Host. For other units, maybe goes up against, Deathwing Knights. He kills like 4 of them, and then the Dire Avengers clean up the last model. Maybe. I mean, the Falcon maybe and them clean up the last model, right? So that's very effective. That's very good. And then he just hops back in the transport. If the transport dies, Asurman's unit can just disembark out the other end to safety, because Falcons are pretty big, so if you do lose the Falcon, it's okay, because he's just going to disembark on the other side anyway. He's going to survive. So he's going to get to continue shooting, which is big. At that point, you can just go behind a wall, pop in and out, just shooting anything in range on that side of the battlefield, or you can engage him within, close combat. He's very good in close combat, does great damage as well. So, with Asurman, Dire Avengers become worth it. They become a unit that has a purpose, right? They are going to be a support piece for Asurman. Now, there are some bad matchups that Asurman has. One of those is tank armies. If somebody's bringing all tanks, Asurman's probably not going to make up his points, but the unit's still going to do something, especially out of a Falcon, because you're rerolling wounds. If you're an Aspect Host, you can give them lethal hits, and with lethal hits, they're doing pretty decent damage against tanks and stuff, right? Like I said before, if you have a lot of volume of attacks with lethals, you won't do nothing. You won't do a ton of damage, but you're not going to do nothing, right? It's going to be good chip damage every turn. Something that you can pair alongside the Falcon, and the Falcon and, Asurman and 5 Dire Avengers, under the effects of a stratagem, can probably take out a good significant chunk of a tank, or maybe even the full tank, right? So you could probably honestly take out a Rhino with that combo. You have a Bright Lance, you have a Pulse Laser, you have a Shuriken Cannon, and I know just taking out a Rhino doesn't seem great, but you could probably also take out a Baby Knight, perhaps. I don't know exactly the average dice on that, but I know for a fact when I was playing against my Chaos Knight buddy early on in the edition, the War Dogs went down pretty easily. I've killed them with just a single Falcon before. All it takes is a couple of failed 5-ups, and they're basically already dead. Like, I think he failed 2 5-ups. I had a Bright Lance and a Pulse Laser. Pulse Laser did like 4 damage. Bright Lance, actually, I think I might have flipped that to an 8 with Fate dice, or to a 6. But I mean, still, right? You're doing a ton of damage with just a Falcon. And then your Dire Avengers and Asurman can finish it off, basically, right? So even in that very poor matchup, you can find ways to eke out value over the course of the game with Asurman that you wouldn't be able to do with just Dire Avengers alone. So bottom line here, Dire Avengers don't have a role by themselves that's useful yet. We may see a change in that when we get the new tournament pack, because there's a number of things they can do to kind of like curb the power of melee armies. And if they are able to do that, then you'll probably see Asurman and friends doing a lot better in general. Because, man, Pry Nexus has been all melee all the time. Shooting armies don't do that well historically in Pry Nexus. I mean, they do fine. Don't get me wrong. People have adapted to it, and the meta has adapted, and that's why shooting armies are able to pull off victories, because they're able to kind of counter melee armies. But melee armies are pushing the envelope in Pry Nexus, right? If your list doesn't have a way of dealing with strong melee, you're going to lose most of your games. That's just a fact, right? At least in a competitive setting. So, we'll see what the future brings with Dire Avengers, but alone, I just don't see them being that good. Asurman, though, is good enough to kind of carry the unit. And in my game so far, all the games I've run with Asurman, he's made up his points at least double. Like, he has made up his points in every single game I've played so far. And again, I don't have a huge, amount of games in right now. I think I have about maybe 10 games with Asurman in total. But every single game he made up, I never found him to be useless. That may change if I go against a tank army, though, but we'll see. I just think mathematically speaking, it's not, his damage isn't terrible. So, honestly, bottom line is, should you take Dire Avengers or not? I think if you're taking Asurman, take some Dire Avengers. I'm definitely going to take Dire Avengers every time I take Asurman. It's just, guys, they're just great together, right? They have a ton of synergy, but without it, not so much. Not so much. So that's kind of where I'm sitting with Dire Avengers. I think they're good with Asurman, not great with anything else. And that's basically it. The reason why, though, is because I don't feel like investing a lot in them either. They're kind of a cheap unit. If I want to invest in something, I'm going to invest in Howling Banshees, right? Like if I'm going to, put Warrior's Focus on a unit, I'm probably going to want to put them on Howling Banshees so that my opponent's not Armor of Contempting them. My opponent's not, messing with them in close combat, giving them -1 damage or something like that. I want them to hit hard and consistent. So I'm going to, use that stratagem for them at that time. But yeah. Okay, so in conclusion, Dire Avengers, they really don't seem that bad at first glance. When you look at their data sheet, they seem okay, right? I thought that when I first looked at them. I was like, oh, great. They lost lethal hits, but they gained a few damage dealing abilities. Perfect. They gained an attack. They gained sustained. Great, right? And they do decent damage against Marine equivalents under the right circumstances, right? 2 kills at range for 75-point unit, not terrible. They do beat out striking scorpions against those targets as well. But their issue is they don't really bring anything else to the table, right? Their biggest call to fame is that they have Asurman, and they can give Asurman sustained hits, which just turns them into an absolute blender. Now, I have heard a few suggestions on how to make them better, how to make them not useless, right? Which include the following: giving them better melee power or durability. Basically, give them some sort of melee weapon that's actually good. Like maybe in combat, instead of, strength 3, they have strength 4, AP -1. Or more durability, so maybe the Shimmer Shield gives the whole unit a 4+ invul or something like that. However, I don't think these changes get them there. This is just my personal opinion. Obviously, they'd be better if they had that, right? They would have a slightly better role to play, but it wouldn't quite be enough to actually take them. Because think about it. A 5-man unit, even with a 4-up invulnerable save, doesn't help them really survive on objectives. It really doesn't. They already have a 5+ invul. That doesn't really help them survive. So the 4+ isn't getting them there. If they had better melee power, that's not really getting them anywhere either, because they already don't do that much melee. Like, you already have better melee units out there that can do way better than them. Like, strength 4, AP -1, it sounds good on paper, but when you actually roll the dice on it, it's 10 attacks. You're probably going to hit about, 7 of them, maybe 6. You're going to wound about half of them. You maybe kill 1 Space Marine. That's not great. So instead of killing 2 Space Marines and then maybe another Space Marine, you're killing like 3 Space Marines. That's like really, that's not good enough, It's not good enough. Doesn't get them there. Now, my suggestion would be to give them the following ability. I think if Dire Avengers had this ability, it would both make lore sense and it would give them a useful role, which I only think is balanced in Eldar factions and Eldar-like factions because of the fragility of the unit. So this is the ability, guys, and tell me in the comment section what you guys think about this. I think because it's Eldar, it's fair. If it was any other tough army out there, it would be broken, but because it's Eldar, it's fair. When this unit is in range of an objective marker, if it is not battle shocked, can't be battle shocked, the objective marker stays under your control regardless of how much OC your opponent has on it. So you could move Dire Avengers up to an objective. They could shoot at the enemy unit, maybe blow some holes in them, then move some Dire Avengers on the unit. And if they're in range of the objective marker, if they're close to that objective, they are getting that objective. It remains under your control regardless of how much OC your opponent has on it. This would give them a very useful role in battling for the midfield. They are Dire Avengers. They are unbreakable, right? They are immovable in defense and aggressive in offense, or whatever they say in the lore, right? I don't exactly know what the lore says, but it's something like that, right? So that's really good. That would be a really good ability because then they could actually have a use, which is Eldar primary control for a more fragile type of and style of army, right? I know some people are going to say that's OP or whatever. I personally think it's balanced because it's Eldar. They're going to be swept aside, right? The 75-point unit with a 4-up armor save, yeah, please, right? They're a little, they're also kind of expensive for that, right? But this would give them, more of a use, I think. And yeah, it would, kind of take away from Asurman's combo and everything like that, but it would give them something that they can do by themselves, which would make them effective. So, is GW going to do this? Are they going to change the rule to this? No, they're not. They're just not, right? That's just pure and simple. Who knows what they do in the next tournament pack? There might be a mission rule that allows you to pick a unit in your army, and that unit gets this rule if it has a certain, if it's under a certain amount of wounds, or maybe a battle line unit can do it, which these guys aren't, so that wouldn't be good for them, but who knows? Only the future will reveal itself. The future will reveal itself in time. But I think this would be a great ability, would make them useful. And unfortunately, they just don't have it. So yeah. So anyway, that's it for today's video, I guess. Dire Avengers, what's my, verdict on them? Take them with Asurman. Maybe take them if your, meta is very horde dependent. Like it has a lot of, if you constantly go against somebody who's just running like 200 infantry at you, yeah, Dire Avengers are great, right? In that kind of situation. But otherwise, they're not really that worth it. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last 2 years. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to become a patron, I have free trials activated. You can get in for free. You can join our Discord for free after you get a Patreon free trial. Of course, if you do want to support the channel, thank you for doing so. It'd mean a lot to me, but you don't have to, of course, to get into the Discord. And members of the Discord can speak to a great and friendly Eldar community who loves talking about strategy, tactics, and hobbying. So yeah, we'd love to talk to you. Come on in, talk to me, talk to other people in the Discord about strategies and stuff. We love it. We love Eldar. I also have a channel store page, which you can get Eldar-inspired apparel from. I posted something about it today. Take a look if you want to. Really cool Eldar, kind of designs and stuff. Check it out. They're subtle also. It's not like too overwhelming. And then lastly, I am an Amazon affiliate, and I do have an Amazon affiliate link in the description if you want to get some discounted Eldar minis. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.